Picture this: Rome, April 7th, 1791, the palace of the Holy Office of the Inquisition. A man stands before a panel of cardinals, their faces stern beneath red skull caps. The room is austere, bare stone walls, high vaulted ceiling, a single crucifix dominating the space. Spring sunlight filters through narrow windows, illuminating dust motes that hang in the air like suspended judgment. The accused stands in the center of the room, and he is unusual. He's not young, approaching 50, if the prosecution's documents are to be believed, but he carries himself with the bearing of royalty. His clothes, though worn from months in prison, were once magnificent. His beard is long, carefully groomed despite his circumstances. His eyes, dark, penetrating, unsettling, move from face to face among his judges. He does not look like a man who expects to die. The chief inquisitor reads the charges. Alessandro, Count di Cagliostro, you stand accused of heresy, of practicing magic and divination, of founding a heretical Masonic sect, of deceiving the faithful, and of claiming powers that belong to God alone. The Count, if that's really his title, smiles slightly. You wish to know my crimes, he says, his Italian flavored with an accent no one can quite place. My crime is that I have lived too long, that I have seen too much, that I possess knowledge your church has spent centuries trying to bury. The cardinals shift uncomfortably. You claim, the inquisitor continues, to be immortal, to have discovered the elixir of eternal life, to have witnessed events from thousands of years ago. These claims are not only heretical, but absurd. Cagliostro's smile widens. Absurd? I was present at the wedding feast at Cana when water became wine. I dined with Cleopatra in Alexandria. I studied in the temples of Egypt when Rome was still a village of mud huts. I have lived 1,000 lives while you have barely completed one. The room erupts in murmurs. One cardinal makes the sign of the cross. You are Giuseppe Balsamo, the inquisitor says firmly, born in Palermo, Sicily, on June 2nd, 1743. The son of Pietro Balsamo, a humble tradesman. We have baptismal records. We have testimony from your own wife. We have documented every fraud you've committed, every lie you've told, every foolish aristocrat you've deceived. Cagliostro's expression doesn't change. You have documents that say a certain Giuseppe Balsamo was born in Palermo, yes, but I am not he, or rather, and here he pauses, his eyes glittering with something that might be amusement or might be madness. I have been many people, many names, many lives. Giuseppe Balsamo was one. Count Cagliostro is another. But the man who stands before you is far older than either name suggests. The inquisitor slams his hand on the table. Enough! You will be found guilty of heresy and condemned to death by burning unless you recant these blasphemous claims. And Cagliostro, Giuseppe Balsamo, the Count, the charlatan, the mystic, whatever he is, throws back his head and laughs. You cannot kill me, he says. I have already died 1,000 times. I will die 1,000 times more, and I will always return. This moment, this confrontation between the Catholic Church's absolute certainty and one man's absolute refusal to submit to it, is the culmination of one of the strangest lives in history. A life that may have begun in a Sicilian slum or in a palace in Arabia, depending on who you believe. A life spent selling immortality to kings and queens, performing miracles that doctors couldn't explain, founding mystical orders that still exist today, and leaving a trail of amazed believers and furious skeptics across 2 decades and a dozen countries. A life that would end in a medieval fortress cell, alone, silenced, officially dead. But a legend that would never die, because Count Cagliostro claimed to be immortal. And in a way, he was right. Not because his elixir worked, it almost certainly didn't, but because his story is too fascinating, too mysterious, too perfectly ambiguous to ever be forgotten. Was he the greatest conman of the Enlightenment? A petty Sicilian criminal who reinvented himself as an aristocratic mystic and fooled half of Europe? Or was he something else? A genuine initiate into ancient mysteries? A man who actually discovered secrets that the establishment wanted buried? The answer is, we still don't know. Not for certain. Not after 230 years of investigation, scholarship, and debate. And that's what makes his story perfect. Before we descend into the smoke and mirrors of Cagliostro's world, I want to ask something of you. If you believe these strange corners of history, where fact and legend become impossible to separate, deserve examination, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Midnight Archives. Your support allows us to continue exploring these mysteries. Tonight, we journey from the slums of Sicily, probably, to the palaces of Europe. From mysterious missing years to spectacular demonstrations of healing and magic. From the heights of fame to the scandal that destroyed the French monarchy. From arrest and trial to imprisonment and a death that may or may not have been real. From historical footnote to immortal legend. This is the story of Count Alessandro di Cagliostro, the man who sold immortality, the healer who might have been genuine, the con man who believed his own lies or didn't, or wasn't a con man at all, the mortal who achieved a kind of immortality despite, or because of, his spectacular failure. This is a story where every fact is disputed, every source is biased, and every conclusion is provisional. In other words, it's perfect. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. Let's start with what the Inquisition claimed to prove. According to the documents they published after his arrest, the man who called himself Count Alessandro di Cagliostro was actually Giuseppe Balsamo, born June 2nd, 1743, in Palermo, Sicily. His father, Pietro Balsamo, was a tradesman, probably a jeweler or metal worker. Accounts vary. His mother, Felicia, came from a slightly more respectable family that had fallen on hard times. The Balsamos were poor, but not destitute. They lived in the Albergheria quarter of Palermo, a rough neighborhood, crowded, dirty, full of petty criminals and desperate people trying to survive. Giuseppe was the youngest of 3 children. His father died when he was young, leaving the family in precarious circumstances. His mother did what many poor but pious Sicilian mothers did. She placed him in a religious institution, hoping he'd become a priest. At 13, Giuseppe entered the Beneventine monastery in Palermo. The monks quickly discovered that their young charge had an extraordinary memory. He could memorize texts after reading them once or twice. But they also discovered he had a talent for forgery. He was caught altering documents, changing records, expelled from the monastery within a year. Next, he was apprenticed to an apothecary. And here, the story gets more interesting, because in that apothecary's shop, Giuseppe Balsamo learned about herbs, chemicals, tinctures, and medicines. He learned which plants could heal and which could harm. He learned how to mix compounds, how to create impressive visual effects with simple chemistry, how to recognize symptoms and prescribe treatments. This knowledge, legitimate pharmaceutical knowledge, would later become the foundation for his miraculous elixirs. But an apothecary's shop in the 1750s, Palermo was also where you learned darker things, poisons, love potions, substances that could create visions or stupor or death. The line between medicine and magic was thin, and Giuseppe learned to walk it. By his late teens, Giuseppe was drifting away from legitimate work and into the Palermo underworld. He became involved in petty crime, forgery, confidence schemes, small frauds. He was good at it, charming, quick-witted, able to read people and tell them what they wanted to hear. And then he made a mistake. This story comes from the Inquisition sources, so take it with appropriate skepticism. But it's a good story, and it might even be true. In 1768, Giuseppe was about 25 years old. He'd established a small reputation as someone who knew occult secrets. He'd position himself as having access to hidden knowledge, to mystical powers that could locate treasure or predict the future. He found a mark, a wealthy goldsmith named Vincenzo Marano. Giuseppe told Marano that he had access to magical techniques that could reveal buried treasure. Palermo, like much of Sicily, was supposedly full of ancient treasures buried by conquering armies. Greek, Roman, Arab, Norman. Everyone knew someone who'd heard about treasure being found. Giuseppe created an elaborate ruse. He drew up official-looking documents and maps showing the location of a fabulous treasure buried in a field outside the city. He performed magical rituals, circles, invocations, the whole theatrical production. He convinced Marano that for a fee, he could use his mystical powers to extract this treasure. Marano paid a substantial sum. Giuseppe led him and several accomplices to the field at midnight. More rituals, more mystical mumbo-jumbo. And then Giuseppe's confederates, hidden in the darkness, attacked. They beat Marano badly, perhaps trying to kill him, perhaps just trying to scare him into silence. But Marano survived, and he went to the authorities. Giuseppe had to flee Sicily immediately. He grabbed what money he had, convinced a local girl named Lorenza Feliciani to come with him, or married her first, sources disagree, and left on the first ship headed away from Palermo. He was running from a relatively minor crime, fraud and assault. But he would never return to Sicily, and the petty criminal Giuseppe Balsamo was about to disappear entirely. Here's where the story becomes genuinely mysterious. From 1768 to 1776, 8 years, we have almost no reliable information about what Giuseppe Balsamo did or where he was. The Inquisition would later claim he wandered around Italy and Europe, running small cons, staying ahead of the law, gradually refining his techniques, that he learned stage magic from traveling performers, picked up languages from the various countries he passed through, and absorbed occult knowledge from books he read in libraries. Cagliostro told a completely different story. He claimed that after leaving Sicily, he traveled east, to Greece, then Egypt, then Arabia, that in Egypt, he met a mysterious figure he called Althotas, an ancient master who recognized Giuseppe's spiritual potential. Althotas, according to Cagliostro, was impossibly old. Hundreds of years old, perhaps thousands. He was an initiate into the genuine ancient mysteries, the secrets that had been taught in the temples of Egypt before the Greeks, before the Romans, before Christianity buried everything under orthodoxy. This master took Giuseppe as a student. They traveled together for years, through Arabia, Persia, India. Everywhere they went, Althotas introduced his student to other masters, other initiates, other bearers of forbidden knowledge. Giuseppe studied alchemy, learning the secret of the philosopher's stone, not just transmuting lead into gold, but transmuting the human soul itself into something divine. He learned Hermetic wisdom, Kabbalistic secrets, Egyptian magic. He learned healing techniques that worked through spiritual rather than physical means. He learned how to extend human life, perhaps indefinitely, and eventually, in Malta, the old master died, or ascended, or simply departed, leaving Giuseppe alone with the burden of this knowledge. Giuseppe took the name Cagliostro, never explaining where it came from or what it meant, and began his mission to spread the ancient wisdom, to heal the sick, to elevate humanity. This is the story Cagliostro told for the rest of his life, never wavering, never changing details, told with such conviction that many who heard it believed completely. So, which version is true? Let's look at what we can actually verify. There was a Giuseppe Balsamo born in Palermo around 1743. Records confirm this. There was a Lorenza Feliciani who married someone claiming to be Giuseppe Balsamo. She would later testify, under Inquisition questioning, that yes, her husband was the Sicilian Giuseppe Balsamo. But, and this is important, she gave that testimony after being arrested, separated from her husband, held by the Inquisition for months, and presumably pressured to cooperate. How reliable is testimony given under those circumstances? There are no records of Giuseppe Balsamo between 1768 and 1776. None. No court documents, no hotel registers, no letters, nothing. For a man supposedly running cons across Europe, he left no trail. When someone calling himself Count Cagliostro appeared in London in 1776, he was sophisticated, educated, multilingual. He spoke fluent Italian, French, English, and German. He had working knowledge of Arabic and Hebrew. He demonstrated expertise in chemistry, medicine, and occult philosophy. Could a self-taught Sicilian criminal with a few years of apothecary training acquire all this knowledge in 8 years while staying one step ahead of the law? Maybe. It's not impossible. Some people are genuinely brilliant autodidacts. But it's strange, and the gap in the records is strange, and the complete transformation from petty criminal to sophisticated mystic is strange. Maybe there's a mundane explanation. Maybe he spent those years in libraries, studying obsessively. Maybe he worked for various apothecaries and doctors, learning from them. Maybe he had a gift for languages. Or maybe, just maybe, something closer to his version is true. Maybe he did travel east. Maybe he did study with someone who taught him genuine secrets, even if that person wasn't literally thousands of years old. Maybe the core of his story is accurate, even if the details are embellished. We don't know. We can't know. And that uncertainty is where the legend lives. Before we leave his origins, we need to talk about Lorenza Feliciani, known as Serafina after her confirmation name. She was 14 or 15 when she met Giuseppe Balsamo. She was from a respectable Roman family that had fallen on hard times. Beautiful, apparently, with the kind of beauty that turns heads. Dark hair, dark eyes, the classic Italian look. Giuseppe either seduced her or genuinely fell in love with her. The sources are divided. They married, records confirm this, and she left her family to follow him into his uncertain future. For over 20 years, Serafina would be at Cagliostro's side. She was part of his performances. He would use her as a medium, claiming she could see visions in crystals or mirrors. She would play the role of the mystical wife, dressed in exotic costumes, speaking in cryptic utterances. Was she a willing partner in the cons, a true believer in his mission, a captive who had no choice? Probably all three, at different times. In the early years, she seems to have been genuinely devoted to him. Letters from the 1770s and early 1780s show affection, partnership, shared purpose. But by the late 1780s, after the scandals, after the constant fleeing from city to city, after decades of living on the edge, she was exhausted, tired of the performance, tired of the danger, tired of him. And when the Inquisition arrested them both in Rome, she broke, testified against him, confirmed he was Giuseppe Balsamo, exposed his methods, took the church's offer of immunity in exchange for cooperation. Cagliostro would call this the ultimate betrayal, but can we blame her? She'd spent her entire adult life following this man's impossible dreams, and it had led to an Inquisition prison. After testifying, Serafina disappeared from history. The church placed her in a convent. Whether she lived out her days there peacefully or miserably, we don't know. She left no records, no letters, no testimony beyond what the Inquisition extracted from her. She was a woman who gambled everything on a man who claimed to be immortal. She lost. Count Alessandro di Cagliostro, as he now called himself, arrived in London in the spring of 1776. America was declaring independence. The Enlightenment was in full bloom. Reason was supposed to be triumphing over superstition. Science was mapping the natural world with increasing precision, and into this rational age walked a man selling magic. Cagliostro and Serafina rented rooms in a fashionable district. They had very little money, certainly not enough to justify the Count title, but they dressed magnificently. Cagliostro wore expensive silk coats, elaborate wigs, jewelry. Serafina appeared in gowns that cost more than most working families earned in a year. Where did the money come from? We don't know. But within weeks of arriving, Cagliostro was being invited to aristocratic salons. He made an immediate impression. First, his appearance was striking. He was stocky, broad-shouldered, with a powerful physical presence. His face was round, olive-skinned, distinctly Mediterranean. But his eyes, everyone mentioned his eyes. Dark, intense, penetrating. The kind of eyes that seem to see through you. Second, his manner was unlike anything London society had encountered. He didn't bow and scrape before the aristocracy. He spoke to dukes and earls as equals, sometimes as inferiors. He was charming but commanding, warm but mysterious. And third, most importantly, he performed miracles. Cagliostro's early demonstrations in London followed a pattern that would remain consistent throughout his career. He would be invited to a wealthy person's home, a salon gathering, perhaps 20 or 30 people, aristocrats, intellectuals, the curious and the skeptical mixed together. Cagliostro would arrive, often deliberately late, building anticipation. He would be dressed dramatically, sometimes in robes he claimed were Egyptian, sometimes in elaborate European court dress, always distinctive. He would spend the first part of the evening simply talking, telling stories about his travels, his studies with ancient masters, the secrets he'd learned. His voice was mesmerizing, deep, warm, accented in a way no one could quite place. Not quite Italian, not quite French, something other. And then he would begin the demonstrations. He would ask for a volunteer, ideally someone skeptical, someone well known, someone whose testimony would carry weight. They would come forward. Cagliostro would look into their eyes, place his hands on their temples, and begin to speak. "You suffer from headaches," he might say. "Sharp pains behind the right eye. They began 2 years ago, after an accident. The doctors have given you medicines, but they don't help. You've learnt to live with the pain, but it's always there." And the volunteer would gasp, because how could he possibly know that? Cold reading, information gathered beforehand from servants, lucky guesses based on age, posture, subtle signs of chronic pain. The techniques are well known to magicians and mentalists, but Cagliostro would continue. The pain comes from a blockage in the spiritual body, not the physical. Your doctors treat the flesh, but the cause is in the soul. Allow me to remove the blockage. He would place his hands on the person's head, begin to chant, words in languages no one recognized. Egyptian, he claimed, the original sacred language. The person would describe feeling warmth, tingling, a sense of pressure releasing, and then, often, the pain would actually lessen or disappear entirely. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because we have multiple accounts from credible witnesses, doctors, skeptics, people who came specifically to expose him, who confirmed that Cagliostro's healing treatments worked. Not always, not on everyone, but often enough that it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. So what was happening? Theory 1, the placebo effect. The placebo effect is powerful. If you believe strongly enough that a treatment will work, your body often responds as if it did work. Pain lessens, symptoms improve, healing accelerates. Cagliostro was a master of creating belief. The exotic costume, the mysterious language, the dramatic presentation, the confidence, all of it worked together to convince people that something extraordinary was happening. And for many conditions, particularly pain, which is partially mediated by the brain, believing you're being healed can actually heal you. Theory 2, genuine medical knowledge. Remember, Cagliostro had worked as an apothecary's assistant. He knew about herbs, compounds, medicinal plants. His elixirs weren't magic potions, but they were genuine tonics containing ingredients with real effects. Willow bark for pain relief contains salicylic acid, the basis for aspirin. Valerian for anxiety, chamomile for digestive issues. Various herbs that actually work, presented in mystical packaging. Add this to his ability to diagnose conditions, not through magic, but through careful observation, questioning, and accumulated experience. And you have someone who could genuinely help people, even if his explanations were supernatural nonsense. Theory 3. Psychosomatic healing. Many illnesses have significant psychological components. Chronic pain, digestive problems, anxiety, depression. These are real physical conditions, but they're affected by mental state. Cagliostro, intentionally or not, was practicing what we'd now call psychotherapy. He gave people attention, listened to them, made them feel seen and understood. He performed elaborate rituals that gave them something to focus on. He offered hope. For people whose symptoms were partially or wholly psychosomatic, this could produce genuine healing. Theory 4. Cherry-picking success. This is the skeptical explanation. Cagliostro treated many people. Some got better. Placebo, coincidence, natural healing. Some didn't. He emphasized the successes and downplayed the failures. His reputation was built on the cases that worked, while the cases that didn't were forgotten. This happens with all alternative medicine practitioners. It's not necessarily deliberate fraud. It's human nature. We remember our successes and forget our failures. Or, and this is the explanation that neither believers nor skeptics like, maybe all of these theories are partially true, and there's also something we don't understand. Maybe Cagliostro was using some combination of placebo effect, genuine herbs, psychological insight, and showmanship. But maybe, occasionally, something else was happening too. Something that worked through mechanisms we still don't fully comprehend. The connection between belief and physiology. The way consciousness affects matter. The power of ritual to create actual changes in reality. This sounds like New Age nonsense. But increasingly, serious scientists studying consciousness, quantum mechanics, and the placebo effect are finding that the relationship between mind and matter is stranger than materialist science assumed. Maybe, just maybe, Cagliostro stumbled onto something real. Not the literal magic he claimed, but something that worked, even if his explanation for why it worked was wrong. We'll never know for certain. But the fact that skeptical doctors witnessed his healings and couldn't fully explain them suggests that whatever he was doing, it wasn't pure theatre. Cagliostro's signature product was his elixir of immortality. He sold it to aristocrats for exorbitant sums. He claimed it could extend human life indefinitely, reverse aging, cure diseases. It was, obviously, not actually an immortality potion. But what was it? The formula was never fully revealed, but chemical analysis of surviving samples and descriptions from the era suggest it contained wine or brandy as a base, melissa, lemon balm for calming effects, saffron for antioxidant properties, aloe for digestive health, various herbs with stimulant properties, possibly small amounts of opiates for pain relief, gold powder, which does nothing but looks impressive. In other words, an expensive herbal tonic that would make most people feel somewhat better. Not magic, but not completely useless either. People who took it reported feeling more energetic, more clear-headed, healthier. This was probably a combination of genuine mild medicinal effects from the herbs, placebo effect from believing in the elixir, lifestyle improvements. People taking an expensive health tonic often also improve their diet and habits. Survivorship bias. Those who felt better talked about it. Those who didn't. Was Cagliostro deliberately defrauding people? Or did he genuinely believe his elixir worked? Probably both. He likely knew it wasn't literally granting immortality, but he probably also believed it had genuine health benefits based on the positive reports he received. The line between con artist and believer was never clear with Cagliostro. But Cagliostro's most significant creation wasn't his healing practice or his elixir. It was his Egyptian rite of Freemasonry. Freemasonry was enormously popular in 18th century Europe. It offered men, and only men in most lodges, a combination of philosophical discussion, ritual drama, social networking, and secret knowledge. There were many different Masonic rites, Scottish Rite, York Rite, various others, each claiming to have preserved authentic ancient secrets. Cagliostro created his own, the Egyptian Rite. He claimed it was the original Freemasonry, predating all others, that its rituals came directly from the temples of ancient Egypt, that Moses himself had been initiated in these mysteries before leading the Israelites out of Egypt. The Egyptian Rite had several revolutionary features. First, it accepted women as full members. This was almost unheard of. Most Masonic lodges were male only. A few had auxiliary women's groups, but with no real authority. Cagliostro's Egyptian Rite made women full participants, able to attain the same degrees as men. Why? Cagliostro claimed that ancient Egyptian initiation included both sexes. That spiritual transformation required the union of masculine and feminine principles. That excluding women was a corruption introduced by later patriarchal societies. This was progressive for 1776. Probably too progressive. Many men were uncomfortable with it. Second, it emphasized spiritual regeneration. The rituals of the Egyptian Rite weren't just symbolic, they were meant to actually transform the participants, to awaken dormant spiritual capacities, to connect initiates with higher beings, whether you interpreted these as angels, spirits, or aspects of one's own higher consciousness. Cagliostro taught techniques for scrying, seeing visions in crystals or mirrors, invoking spiritual entities, achieving altered states of consciousness, physical rejuvenation through spiritual means, communicating with one's holy guardian angel. A concept he may have introduced to Western occultism. Third, it was expensive. Initiation into the Egyptian Rite cost a substantial sum. Progressing through the degrees cost more. The special rituals, the private consultations with Cagliostro himself, all expensive. Critics, then and now, point to this as evidence of fraud. He was selling secrets that didn't exist. Defenders argue that the expense ensured only serious students joined, that maintaining the lodges, producing the elaborate ritual materials, and Cagliostro's time had real costs. Both are probably true. What happened in an Egyptian Rite initiation? Accounts from participants describe an intense, theatrical, transformative experience. You would arrive at the lodge after dark, be blindfolded and led through corridors, hear chanting in unknown languages, smell strong incense, frankincense, myrrh, other resins burning. The blindfold would be removed in a room lit only by candles, symbols painted on the walls, Egyptian hieroglyphics, astrological signs, mystical diagrams. Cagliostro himself presiding, dressed in elaborate robes, a staff in his hand. You would undergo symbolic death and rebirth, lie in a coffin while prayers were said over you, rise again, transformed, with a new name, your magical name, known only to fellow initiates. You would swear oaths of secrecy, be taught secret signs and words, be instructed in the history of the rite, mostly invented but compelling. And then, the centerpiece, you would participate in a ritual designed to contact your higher self or guardian spirit. This often involved scrying. You would gaze into a crystal or mirror while Cagliostro chanted. After some time, many participants reported actually seeing things, visions, symbols, even faces or figures appearing in the reflective surface. How much was suggestion? How much was altered states induced by incense and sensory manipulation? How much was genuine spiritual experience? Impossible to say. But people came out of these initiations genuinely changed, convinced they'd experienced something profound. Was it real magic? No, probably not in the literal sense. But was it psychologically real? Did it create genuine transformation in the participants? Absolutely. And in that sense, maybe it was magic after all. By late 1776, Cagliostro was the talk of London. His Egyptian Rite Lodge had dozens of members, including some quite wealthy and influential people. His healing practice was booked months in advance. His elixir was selling well. He should have settled down, built a permanent practice, lived comfortably off his success. But that's not what he did, because Cagliostro was restless, always moving, always seeking the next horizon. Whether this was because he was staying ahead of exposure or because he was genuinely on some kind of spiritual mission, we don't know. In 1777, he and Serafina left London. They would spend the next 8 years touring Europe, and everywhere they went, the pattern would repeat: arrival, success, scandal, departure. It was a way of life that couldn't last forever, but for a while, it must have felt like immortality. Over the next 8 years, Cagliostro and Serafina moved through Europe like mystical royalty. The Hague, Brussels, Leipzig, Berlin, Mitau, modern-day Jelgava, Latvia, St. Petersburg, Warsaw, Vienna. They left a trail of amazed believers and wealthy patrons. The pattern was always the same. They would arrive in a city with letters of introduction from their previous conquests. Aristocrats love novelty, and an Egyptian mystic who could heal illnesses and reveal secrets was certainly novel. Cagliostro would establish himself, usually by healing someone prominent. A duchess with chronic headaches, a general with an old war wound that wouldn't heal, a wealthy merchant's wife suffering from melancholy. Word would spread. More people would come seeking healing. The Egyptian Rite Lodge would be established, attracting wealthy members. Serafina would hold salons where she would demonstrate clairvoyance, gazing into crystals and reporting visions. Money would flow in, lots of money, fees for healing, fees for initiation, sales of elixirs, donations from grateful patients. And Cagliostro would spend it all on elaborate costumes and equipment for rituals, on expensive lodgings, on lavish entertainments for potential patrons, on gifts to win favor, on maintaining the appearance of nobility. He lived like a count, even if he probably wasn't one, but he was also genuinely helping people. The testimonials are too numerous to dismiss. Chronic conditions improved. People claimed to feel better, to have more energy, to have gained insights that changed their lives. And then, inevitably, skepticism would build. Who was this foreigner, really? Were his healings genuine or deception? Why did he live so extravagantly? Was this all just an elaborate confidence scheme? And Cagliostro, sensing the tide turning, would move on to the next city, the next group of believers, the next opportunity. But in Strasbourg, something different happened. Cagliostro arrived in 1780 and immediately performed one of his most impressive healings. The Princess Caroline of Baden-Baden was staying in Strasbourg, suffering from a chronic illness that no doctor could cure. She was young, only in her 30s, but she'd been sick for years. Constant pain, extreme fatigue, symptoms that came and went unpredictably. Modern doctors might diagnose fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome, conditions that don't show up on standard medical tests, but are nevertheless debilitating. Cagliostro treated her, and she recovered. Not immediately, but over several weeks of treatments, her symptoms lessened and then disappeared. She felt healthy for the first time in years. The princess was so grateful that she became one of Cagliostro's most devoted patrons. She introduced him to the Cardinal de Rohan, one of the most powerful men in France. The cardinal was immediately fascinated. Cardinal Louis-René Edouard de Rohan was everything a Catholic cardinal shouldn't be: worldly, ambitious, scandalous in his personal life, more interested in power and pleasure than piety. He'd been ambassador to Vienna, where he'd managed to insult Marie Antoinette so badly that she refused to speak to him. He desperately wanted to regain royal favor, to become Prime Minister of France, and he was drawn to the occult, to secret knowledge, to anything that promised power or insight. Cagliostro and the cardinal became close, very close. The cardinal made Cagliostro his spiritual advisor, consulted him on everything, gave him apartments in his palace. For 3 years, 1780 to 1783, Cagliostro lived in luxury in Strasbourg, protected by one of the most powerful men in France. His Egyptian Rite Lodge flourished. He healed hundreds of people. He was at the absolute peak of his success. He should have stayed there. But in 1783, the cardinal convinced him to come to Paris, to the center of European culture and power, where the stakes were highest and where everything would go catastrophically wrong. When Cagliostro arrived in Paris in late 1784, the city was in the grip of what we might call an occult fever. The Enlightenment was supposed to have banished superstition. Reason was supposed to reign supreme. But instead, Parisians of all classes were obsessed with mysticism, mesmerism, secret societies, and spiritual phenomena. Franz Mesmer was performing his animal magnetism demonstrations. Early hypnosis mixed with mystical explanation. Spiritualists were holding seances. Alchemists were claiming they'd discovered the philosopher's stone. The city was full of mystics, charlatans, and genuine seekers, all mixed together. Into this environment, Cagliostro fit perfectly. He established himself with characteristic grandeur, expensive apartments, elaborate entertaining. His Egyptian Rite Lodge attracted prominent members, nobles, intellectuals, wealthy merchants. Marie Antoinette's own circle included people who attended Cagliostro's rituals, and he maintained his close connection to Cardinal de Rohan, who was still desperately trying to regain the Queen's favor after insulting her years before. This connection, this relationship between a mystic conman, or genuine adept, depending on your view, and a foolish, ambitious cardinal would bring down both of them and almost bring down the French monarchy itself. The disaster began with jewelry. In 1772, the jewelers Baumer and Bassange had created the most expensive piece of jewelry in European history. It was a diamond necklace of extraordinary size and complexity, 647 diamonds arranged in festoons and tassels, designed to be draped across the chest and shoulders. The estimated value was 1,600,000 livres, roughly the equivalent of $15 to $20 million today. It had been commissioned by King Louis XV for his mistress, Madame du Barry. But Louis XV died before the purchase was completed. The jewelers were left with this incredibly expensive necklace and no buyer. They tried to sell it to the new king, Louis XVI, for his wife Marie Antoinette. She refused. It was too expensive, too ostentatious, too scandalous. She didn't want to be associated with her husband's grandfather's mistress. But the jewelers were desperate. They'd invested everything in this piece. They kept trying to convince the royal family to buy it. And into this situation walked a con artist who saw an opportunity. Jeanne de la Motte Valois was a fascinating character in her own right. She was born into poverty, but claimed descent from an illegitimate branch of the royal Valois family. She may have actually had some royal blood. France was full of impoverished descendants of illegitimate royal bastards. But it didn't come with money or position. She'd clawed her way up through charm, beauty, strategic sexual relationships, and sheer audacity. By the 1780s, she'd married a minor military officer and established herself on the fringes of Versailles society. But she was always desperate for money, always one step away from losing everything, always looking for an angle. And in 1784, she came up with the con of the century. Jeanne knew two important facts. First, Cardinal de Rohan desperately wanted to regain Marie Antoinette's favor. He was obsessed with the idea. He'd do almost anything for a sign that the Queen had forgiven him. Second, the jewelers still had that incredibly expensive necklace they couldn't sell, and they were getting desperate. Jeanne's plan was audacious. Convince the cardinal that the Queen secretly wanted the necklace, but couldn't purchase it publicly. Political optics, she'd claim. The Queen would use the cardinal as an intermediary. He would purchase the necklace on her behalf. She would pay him back secretly, and he would win her eternal gratitude. The cardinal would get what he wanted, the Queen's favor. The jewelers would get what they wanted, payment. Jeanne would steal the necklace, break it up, sell the diamonds, and be rich. It was an elaborate, multi-layered fraud that required convincing the cardinal that he was in secret correspondence with the Queen herself. And this is where Cagliostro enters the story. Jeanne de la Motte knew that Cardinal de Rohan relied heavily on Cagliostro's mystical counsel. The cardinal consulted him on everything: political decisions, personal matters, spiritual questions. If Cagliostro endorsed something, the cardinal would believe it. So Jeanne approached Cagliostro with her scheme. Or rather, she approached him with a carefully edited version of her scheme. What exactly she told him, we don't know. But somehow she convinced him to participate in her plan to bring the cardinal and Queen together. Here's the central mystery. Was Cagliostro an active co-conspirator, fully aware of the fraud? Or was he himself duped by Jeanne's story? The evidence is genuinely unclear. Jeanne forged letters supposedly from Marie Antoinette to Cardinal de Rohan. These letters suggested that the Queen had forgiven him and wanted to communicate secretly. The cardinal, desperate to believe this, accepted the letters as genuine. Jeanne arranged a nighttime meeting in the gardens of Versailles. She hired a prostitute who resembled the Queen, dressed her in appropriate clothing, and staged a brief encounter in the darkness. The cardinal, already primed to believe, met this impersonator and was convinced he'd secretly met with Marie Antoinette. Armed with these proofs that the Queen favored him, the cardinal was ready to believe anything. And when Jeanne told him the Queen secretly wanted the necklace, he consulted Cagliostro. What happened in that consultation is one of the crucial moments in the entire affair. According to later testimony, Cagliostro performed one of his mystical rituals. He had the cardinal sit in a darkened room while he invoked spiritual forces. Then he consulted his method of divination, probably having Serafina in another room providing visions based on what Jeanne had told them to say. And Cagliostro delivered his prophecy. Yes, the Queen truly desired this necklace. Yes, the cardinal should act as intermediary. And more. This action would elevate the cardinal to the position of prime minister. It would fulfill all his ambitions. The cardinal believed completely. Cagliostro had never been wrong before. So the cardinal agreed to the scheme. He approached the jewelers on behalf of the queen. He negotiated terms. The necklace would be paid for in installments. He signed documents guaranteeing payment. And in February 1785, he handed over the necklace to Jeanne's accomplice, who was dressed as one of the queen's ladies-in-waiting. The jewelers received their first installment, paid by the cardinal from his own funds, expecting reimbursement, and Jeanne immediately broke up the necklace, sold the diamonds, began living extravagantly. The scheme might have worked except for one detail. The jewelers sent a letter to Marie Antoinette thanking her for her purchase. The queen had no idea what they were talking about. She summoned the jewelers, learned about the necklace, the cardinal's involvement, the supposed secret arrangement. She was furious. This was an insult to her reputation, an implication that she was conducting secret financial dealings, or worse. She went to Louis XVI, demanded that the cardinal be arrested immediately. On August the 15th, 1785, the Feast of the Assumption, in a ceremony at Versailles, with hundreds of courtiers present, the king had Cardinal de Rohan arrested publicly, humiliated before the entire court, taken to the Bastille. And in the investigation that followed, Cagliostro's name came up immediately, as the cardinal's mystical advisor, as the person who'd confirmed the Queen's involvement. On August 22nd, 1785, officers appeared at Cagliostro's apartments and arrested him too. Cagliostro was taken to the Bastille, the infamous royal prison in Paris. He was held in relatively comfortable conditions as a prominent figure accused of fraud rather than treason. But he was still a prisoner, and he was terrified, because the investigation quickly uncovered his past. The Inquisition, learning that Cagliostro was in custody, sent documents about Giuseppe Balsamo from Sicily, about the con schemes, the treasure map fraud, the flight from Palermo. His mystical persona was being systematically dismantled. Letters were published in newspapers. Pamphlets appeared, mocking the Grand Copter, one of Cagliostro's titles in the Egyptian rite. Satirical cartoons showed him as a charlatan in exotic costume, fooling gullible aristocrats. Paris, which had venerated him just months before, now laughed at him. The trial itself was a sensation. It lasted 9 months. All of Paris followed every detail. Was Cardinal de Rohan a fool or a co-conspirator? Was the Queen involved? She wasn't, but many people believe she was. Who was this Cagliostro really? Was he an Egyptian count or a Sicilian conman? Had he deliberately helped perpetrate fraud against the crown? Cagliostro's defense was simple. He'd been fooled, just like the cardinal. He'd believed Jean de la Motte's story. His mystical predictions were genuine spiritual insights, not deliberate fraud. He thought he was helping bring the Queen and Cardinal together, not participating in theft. Was this true? Maybe. Cagliostro had never before been implicated in outright criminal fraud. His usual pattern was mystical theater, not theft. It's plausible that Jeanne manipulated him along with the Cardinal. Or maybe he was lying. Maybe he was a co-conspirator who saw an opportunity for a massive score and took it. We don't know. The trial couldn't determine it either. On May 31st, 1786, the verdict was announced. Jean de la Motte, guilty, sentenced to public whipping, branding and imprisonment. Cardinal de Rohan, acquitted. The court found he'd been duped by a clever con artist. His property was returned, and Cagliostro, acquitted of all charges. The court found that he'd given spiritual advice to the cardinal, but hadn't participated in or benefited from the fraud. He was a dupe, not a criminal. Cagliostro was released from the Bastille on June 3rd, 1786. He should have been relieved. He'd been found not guilty. He was free, but his reputation was destroyed. The trial had exposed too much. His past as Giuseppe Balsamo, his methods of producing miracles, the fact that he'd been wrong about the Queen's intentions, calling into question all his other prophecies. The mystique was shattered. And without mystique, Cagliostro was just a foreigner in expensive clothes, claiming powers he couldn't prove. The cardinal, though acquitted, was banished from Paris by a furious Marie Antoinette. His protection of Cagliostro was over, and Cagliostro himself was given a choice: leave France immediately or face arrest for other offences. He chose to leave. On June 30th, 1786, Cagliostro and Serafina departed Paris. They would never return to France. The diamond necklace affair had consequences far beyond Cagliostro's personal disgrace. It destroyed public faith in the royal family. Marie Antoinette, though innocent, was seen as somehow complicit. People believed she was wasteful, corrupt, conducting secret dealings. The ridiculous phrase, "let them eat cake," which she never said, became associated with her around this time. The cardinal's public humiliation showed that even the church's princes weren't safe from royal displeasure. It alienated powerful church factions. The whole affair demonstrated the credulity, wastefulness, and disconnection from reality of the French aristocracy. Historians argue about how much the diamond necklace affair contributed to the French Revolution. Some say it was a major factor, eroding faith in the monarchy. Others say it was just one of many scandals. But there's no question it damaged the royal family's reputation irreparably. And at the center of the scandal, whether as villain, dupe, or innocent bystander, was the immortal Count Cagliostro, whose mystical powers had failed to foresee his own ruin. After fleeing France, Cagliostro and Serafina went to London. It seemed like a logical choice. He'd been successful there before. Perhaps he could rebuild. But London in 1786 was very different from London in 1776. The newspapers had followed the diamond necklace affair obsessively. The British press, always ready to mock the French, had covered every scandalous detail, and they'd paid special attention to Cagliostro, the mystic who'd fooled a cardinal, the supposed Egyptian count who was revealed as a Sicilian criminal. When Cagliostro arrived in London, the papers savaged him. Satirical cartoons appeared showing him as the Grand Copter in ridiculous Egyptian costume, selling bottles of elixir to foolish aristocrats. One famous print showed him as a jackass in a wig, braying about his magical powers. The pamphlets were worse. Anonymous writers published exposés claiming to reveal all his tricks. Some were probably accurate. Many were wildly exaggerated or completely invented. It didn't matter. The damage was done. Cagliostro tried to defend himself. He published a pamphlet explaining his side of the diamond necklace affair. He tried to establish a new Egyptian rite lodge. He attempted to rebuild his healing practice. None of it worked. The magic, literal or figurative, was gone. No one came for healing. No one wanted initiation into his mysteries. The aristocrats who'd once fawned over him now avoided him. He was reduced to filing lawsuits against newspapers for libel. He won some of these cases technically, receiving token damages. But legally vindication didn't restore his reputation. By early 1787, Cagliostro was essentially broke. He'd spent all his money maintaining appearances, fighting legal battles, trying to stay relevant. He had to leave London. But where could he go? For the next 2 years, Cagliostro and Serafina wandered through Europe like ghosts. They went to Basel, Switzerland, then to Turin, Italy, then to Rovereto, then to Trent. Everywhere they went, the pattern was the same. They'd arrive, attempt to establish themselves, be recognized and shunned, move on. The mystique was gone. Word had spread. The great Count Cagliostro was revealed as Giuseppe Balsamo, a charlatan from Sicily. His powers were fake. His past was a lie. Some people still believed in him. There were small pockets of Egyptian rite members who maintained that the diamond necklace affair had been a conspiracy against him, that he was genuinely persecuted for knowing too much. But these believers were few, and they had no money. Cagliostro was aging. He was in his mid-40s now, if the Balsamo birth date was correct, and the years of stress were showing. His health was declining. Serafina was tired, exhausted from decades of constant travel, constant performance, constant uncertainty. They needed to settle somewhere. But everywhere they went, they were unwelcome. And then, Cagliostro made a decision that would prove fatal. He decided to go to Rome. Rome was the most dangerous possible destination. Rome was the seat of the Catholic Church, the headquarters of the Inquisition, a city where papal authority was absolute, and Cagliostro was a Freemason, already condemned by the Church. More than that, he'd founded his own Masonic rite that explicitly claimed to supersede Catholic teaching. His Egyptian mysteries supposedly predated Christianity and represented the true ancient wisdom. This was heresy by any definition. Going to Rome was insane. Why did he do it? Theory 1. Arrogance. Maybe he still believed in his own legend. He'd been acquitted in Paris. He'd defeated the Inquisition's previous attempts to touch him. He was famous, protected by his celebrity. Maybe he thought he was untouchable. Theory 2. Desperation. Maybe he had nowhere else to go. He'd been expelled from France, mocked in England, unwelcome in German and Swiss cities. His money was gone. He needed a fresh start, and Italy was at least familiar territory. Theory 3. A death wish. Maybe he was tired. Tired of running, tired of performing, tired of the constant struggle to maintain an impossible persona. Maybe going to Rome was a form of surrender, forcing a final confrontation. Theory 4. Genuine mission. Maybe he actually believed he could convert the church. He'd convinced cardinals, healed hundreds, created a mystical movement. Perhaps he thought he could demonstrate his powers to the Pope himself, vindicate his teachings, and revolutionize Christianity. This sounds delusional, but Cagliostro had always had grandiose ideas about his mission. Whatever his reasoning, in 1789, Cagliostro and Serafina entered Rome. They moved into lodgings in the city, kept a relatively low profile at first, but Cagliostro couldn't help himself. He began trying to recruit for his Egyptian rite. This was catastrophically stupid. The Inquisition learned of Cagliostro's presence almost immediately. They'd been interested in him for years, a heretical Freemason who claimed mystical powers, who'd been involved in scandal in France, who represented everything the church opposed. But they didn't arrest him immediately. Instead, they watched. They infiltrated his attempts at recruitment, sent informants to his meetings, documented everything he said and did. They were building a case, making sure it was airtight. And then they approached Serafina. We don't know exactly what the Inquisition said to Serafina, but we can imagine. She was 45 years old. She'd spent half her life following this man, from Sicily to London to Paris to exile. She'd been arrested, imprisoned, humiliated. She'd lived in luxury and in poverty, always uncertain, always moving. She was exhausted, completely, utterly exhausted. And the Inquisition offered her a way out. Testify against him, confirm he's Giuseppe Balsamo, explain his methods, and in return, immunity, protection, a place in a convent where she could live out her days in peace. Maybe they also threatened her. Maybe they offered money. Maybe they simply convinced her that he was damned and that saving her own soul required truth. We don't know her motives, but we know what she did. She agreed to testify, and she gave them everything they needed. On December 27th, 1789, Inquisition officers came to Cagliostro's lodgings. He must have known immediately what was happening. There was no reason for the Inquisition to visit except for arrest. Did he resist, try to escape? The records don't say, but probably not. Where would he run? He was in the heart of papal territory, surrounded by the church's power. They took him to Castel Sant'Angelo, the massive cylindrical fortress on the Tiber that served as the Inquisition's prison. He was placed in a cell, and the investigation began. Cagliostro would never leave that prison complex. He would never see freedom again. His years of wandering, his decades of performance and mysticism and grand claims, all of it ended in a stone cell in Rome. The man who claimed to be immortal would die in darkness. But not yet. First came the trial. The Inquisition's investigation lasted over a year, from his arrest in December 1789 to the trial's conclusion in April 1791. They were thorough. They wanted to document everything: his real identity, his methods, his teachings, his contacts, his crimes. The interrogations followed a pattern refined over centuries. The Inquisition had been extracting confessions since the Middle Ages. They knew how to break people, but there was no physical torture, at least not officially. By the late 18th century, the Church had officially abolished torture in most circumstances. They relied instead on psychological pressure, isolation, and theological argument. Cagliostro was held in solitary confinement. He had no contact with other prisoners, no news from outside, no idea what was happening with his case. Just his cell, his interrogators, and his thoughts. They would bring him to an interrogation room. 3 or 4 inquisitors would be present, along with a notary recording everything. They would ask questions, demand answers, present evidence. And Cagliostro, for the first several months, maintained his persona. Yes, he said, he was Count Alessandro di Cagliostro. No, he was not Giuseppe Balsamo from Sicily. Or rather, that was one of many names he'd used. But it wasn't his true identity. His true identity was older. Much older. He couldn't remember his birth because it was too long ago. Centuries, perhaps millennia. He'd been initiated into the true ancient mysteries in Egypt. He possessed the secrets of immortality, of spiritual transformation, of direct communication with higher beings. His Egyptian rite wasn't heresy. It was the original religion, the wisdom that existed before Moses, before Christ, before all modern religions. Christianity itself was a corruption of these original truths. He'd healed hundreds, maybe thousands of people. He'd restored health where doctors had failed. He'd given hope to the hopeless. Was he a magician? Yes, in the original sense of the word, a magus, a wise man, an initiate into cosmic secrets. Did he practice Freemasonry? Yes, because Freemasonry preserved fragments of the ancient wisdom, though most Masons didn't understand what they possessed. Was he a threat to the Church? No, He was trying to restore Christianity to its true mystical roots, to save it from becoming merely a political institution. The inquisitors listened to all this with stony faces, and then they began dismantling his claims piece by piece. They produced baptismal records from Palermo. Here, they said, is Giuseppe Balsamo, born June 2nd, 1743, to Pietro and Felicia Balsamo. They produced testimony from relatives of Giuseppe Balsamo in Sicily, who described the young man. Descriptions that matched Cagliostro's appearance. They produced Serafina. She testified that yes, she'd married Giuseppe Balsamo, that her husband was the same man now calling himself Cagliostro. They traced his movements through Europe, showed the pattern of fraud accusations following him, documented the schemes in Palermo that forced him to flee. They demonstrated that his Egyptian rituals had no ancient sources, that he'd invented them, drawing from books available in European libraries, that the hieroglyphics and symbols he used were gibberish, not authentic ancient Egyptian writing. They analyzed his elixirs, found no magical ingredients, just herbs and wine. They exposed his methods of cold reading, showed how he gathered information about clients beforehand, explained the techniques of stage magic that produced his miraculous phenomena. They questioned his prophecies, noted how many had been wrong, showed that the ones that came true were either lucky guesses or vague enough to fit multiple outcomes. They attacked his Egyptian rite, called it a heretical perversion of Freemasonry, noted that it encouraged people to seek spiritual truth outside the church, which was definitionally heretical. And they presented all this evidence to Cagliostro, demanded he respond. At some point during the interrogation, we don't know exactly when, something in Cagliostro changed. Maybe it was the weight of evidence, maybe it was the isolation, maybe it was simple exhaustion, maybe it was a calculated decision that confession would lead to a lighter sentence. Or maybe, and this is the most interesting possibility, he'd been performing for so long that he'd forgotten where the performance ended and his real self began. And now, confronted with undeniable evidence, he had to reconcile two competing versions of reality. He began to admit certain facts. Yes, he'd been born Giuseppe Balsamo in Palermo. Yes, he'd left Sicily under questionable circumstances. Yes, he'd invented the name Cagliostro, though he still wouldn't explain where the name came from. Yes, some of his phenomena had been produced through trickery, but, and he was adamant about this, the core was real. He genuinely had healing abilities. He genuinely had studied with masters during his travels. He genuinely believed in the spiritual transformation offered by his Egyptian rite. The trickery, he claimed, was necessary because people wouldn't believe in genuine spiritual truth if it was presented plainly. They needed theater, mystery, wonder. The tricks were a teaching tool, not the teaching itself. This is a fascinating defense because it's essentially unfalsifiable. How do you prove that someone's subjective spiritual experiences aren't real? How do you demonstrate that healings that seem to work didn't actually work, just not for the reasons claimed? The Inquisition didn't care about these philosophical nuances. They had a simpler framework. He'd claimed powers that belong only to God. That was heresy. Everything else was details. On April 7th, 1791, formal charges were filed against Alessandro, Count di Cagliostro, also known as Giuseppe Balsamo. First, heresy, claiming to possess knowledge of divine mysteries outside the teachings of the Holy Catholic Church. Second, practicing magic and divination attempting to predict the future and control supernatural forces. Third, founding a heretical Masonic sect, the Egyptian Rite, which taught doctrines contrary to Catholic dogma. Fourth, deceiving the faithful, selling false cures and taking money for spiritual services. Fifth, blasphemy, claiming powers and knowledge that belong to God alone. The penalty for these crimes, particularly for someone who refused to fully recant, was death by burning. This was still the standard punishment for heresy in 1791. The Inquisition had been burning heretics for centuries. The fact that it was the Age of Enlightenment, that just across the Alps the French Revolution was overthrowing old authorities, none of that mattered in Rome. In papal territory, the old rules still applied. April 21st, 1791. Cagliostro was found guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to death by burning. But then, something unexpected happened. Pope Pius VI personally intervened and commuted the sentence. Instead of execution, Cagliostro would be imprisoned for life in the harshest conditions possible. Perpetual, solitary confinement. Why the mercy? Several theories. Theory 1. Public relations. Executing someone for claiming to be immortal seemed ironic and might create a martyr. Better to let him rot in prison, forgotten. Theory 2. Political calculation. Europe was watching. France was in revolutionary chaos. The Catholic Church didn't need more controversy. Theory 3. Residual doubt. Maybe even the Pope wasn't entirely certain Cagliostro was just Giuseppe Balsamo. Maybe there was enough mystery, enough unanswered questions, that executing him felt wrong. Theory 4. Strategic cruelty. Death would have been mercy. Imprisoning him forever was crueler. It ensured that his legend would die slowly as he was forgotten. Whatever the reason, the sentence was pronounced: life imprisonment in the fortress of San Leo in perpetual solitude. But the Inquisition wasn't done destroying Cagliostro's legacy. In 1791, they published an official biography, Compendium of the Life and Deeds of Giuseppe Balsamo, self-styled Count of Cagliostro. It was a thorough hatchet job. Every incident from his past was included and interpreted in the most damaging light possible. The treasure map, fraud in Sicily, his wanderings across Europe, his supposed deceptions, his methods of producing fake miracles. The biography was translated into multiple languages and distributed across Europe. It was meant to kill the Cagliostro legend forever, to show that the great mystic was just a petty criminal from Sicily who'd gotten lucky. But legends are harder to kill than the Inquisition anticipated. The fortress of San Leo sits atop a massive limestone cliff in the region of Marche, central Italy. It's a medieval structure, rebuilt and reinforced over centuries, almost completely inaccessible. The only approach is a single winding road carved into the rock. It was the perfect prison. Cagliostro was transferred there in the spring of 1791. He was taken to a special cell called the Pozzetto, the little well. It had originally been a cistern, a water storage tank carved deep into the rock. When it was no longer needed for water, the Inquisition converted it into a cell for their most dangerous prisoners. The only entrance was through a trapdoor in the ceiling. Prisoners were lowered down on ropes. Once inside, there was no way out, no windows, no natural light, just stone walls, a floor, a small air shaft for ventilation. It was a tomb for the living. Cagliostro spent 23 hours a day in the pozzetto. For 1 hour each day, he was allowed out into a slightly larger cell where he could read approved religious texts. The Bible, lives of the saints, theological works meant to bring him to repentance. Food was lowered through the trapdoor 3 times a day. Basic prison fare. Bread, thin soup, occasionally some vegetables. Nothing like the lavish meals he'd once enjoyed. He had no contact with other prisoners, no visitors, no letters, no news from the outside world. The guards who tended him were under strict orders not to speak to him beyond the absolute minimum necessary for maintaining the prison routine. He was completely alone. The Inquisition's goal was clear: break his spirit, force him to true repentance, get him to recant everything, his teachings, his claims, his Egyptian rite, reduce him to a repentant sinner begging for God's mercy. The reports from the guards are contradictory and must be treated skeptically. They had every reason to report what the church wanted to hear. Some reports claim he went mad quickly, that within months he was talking to himself, raving, claiming to see visions in the darkness. That isolation destroyed his mind. Other reports say he remained dignified and defiant, that he refused to recant, that when guards asked if he repented, he would laugh and say that he had nothing to repent. One story, possibly apocryphal, claims he spent his time writing on the walls with charcoal. Alchemical formulas, mystical symbols, fragments of Egyptian rite rituals, as if even in that darkness he was trying to preserve his teachings. Another story claims he attempted an escape. Supposedly, he had somehow acquired or improvised tools and tried to dig through the stone walls. He was caught, punished with even stricter confinement. But the fact that he tried suggests his spirit wasn't completely broken. We don't know what's true. The church controlled all information coming out of San Leo. They could report whatever served their purposes. What we know for certain is that Alessandro di Cagliostro, Giuseppe Balsamo, the Egyptian mystic, the Immortal Count, the Grand Copter, lived in that cell for over 4 years. On August 26, 1795, a guard opening the cell found Cagliostro dead. The official report stated he died of apoplexy, a stroke. Age 52, if the Balsamo birth date was accurate. The body was examined by a physician who confirmed death by natural causes. No signs of violence, no obvious poisoning. He was buried in the fortress grounds, in an unmarked grave, no funeral, no ceremony, no marker. The church wanted him forgotten, but almost immediately doubts surfaced. Cagliostro, despite his imprisonment, had been in relatively good health. Witnesses from earlier in 1795 described him as thin but not sickly. No reports of chronic illness. Death came suddenly, no warning, no lingering decline, and the timing was convenient. The French Revolutionary Wars were spreading. Napoleon was conquering Italy. The old order was collapsing. San Leo fortress would soon be threatened. Killing Cagliostro before chaos overtook the region would ensure his legend couldn't be resurrected. Within months, some people were claiming he'd been secretly executed, he'd been poisoned slowly, he'd been allowed to die of neglect, he'd faked his death and escaped. This last theory, that he faked his death and escaped, gained surprising traction. Proponents pointed out the body was examined only by a church physician who had every reason to certify death burial was immediate and secret. No independent witnesses saw the body. Within months, there were sightings of someone resembling Cagliostro in various Italian cities. The most romantic version of this theory claimed that Cagliostro's Egyptian rite initiates organized a rescue, that they bribed guards, substituted another body, and smuggled him out. That he lived out his remaining years in secret, perhaps in Sicily, where it all began, dying peacefully as an old man. This is almost certainly fantasy, but it shows how much people wanted to believe the immortal Count couldn't truly die. The most likely explanation is the boring one. He died of a stroke or heart attack, probably brought on by years of terrible conditions. Solitary confinement is extraordinarily damaging to human psychology and physiology. Depression, stress, lack of exercise, poor nutrition, all of these increase the risk of cardiovascular disease. A 52-year-old man who'd spent 4 years in a cell might very well have a fatal stroke. The church had no need to execute him. Time and neglect were doing that job. So Cagliostro probably died exactly as the report stated. A sudden collapse. A natural death, if death in such conditions can be called natural. His body was buried somewhere in the fortress grounds. The exact location was never recorded, deliberately, to prevent his grave from becoming a pilgrimage site. When Napoleon's armies occupied the region, San Leo Fortress was converted to other uses. Renovations over the centuries changed the grounds. Graves were lost. Today, no one knows where Cagliostro's bones lie. The man who claimed to be immortal was erased, even in death. But the church's hope that Cagliostro would be forgotten was disappointed. The publication of his biography, meant to discredit him, actually kept his story alive. People read about his exploits, his claims, his extraordinary life. And some chose to focus not on the Inquisition's condemnation, but on how remarkable he'd been. Within a decade, sightings began. Someone matching Cagliostro's description was reported in Vienna, in Venice, in Paris, even as far away as Russia. Were these hoaxes, misidentifications, con artists deliberately imitating him? Probably. But the persistence of the sightings shows something important. People wanted to believe he'd survived. The man who promised immortality couldn't be allowed to simply die. By the 1820s to 1840s, the Romantic movement was in full swing. Romantics were fascinated by the mysterious, the exotic, the transgressive. They loved outcasts, rebels, people who defied authority. Cagliostro was perfect for them. Alexandre Dumas, author of The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo, wrote extensively about Cagliostro. He created a semi-fictional version that emphasized his mysterious origins, his incredible adventures, his persecution by establishment powers. Dumas's Cagliostro was a romantic hero. Yes, probably a charlatan, but a magnificent charlatan. A man who'd lived multiple lives, who'd dared to challenge both church and monarchy, who'd almost succeeded in transforming European spirituality. This romantic version of Cagliostro influenced how he was remembered, not as a petty criminal from Sicily, but as a fascinating enigma. But the most significant resurrection of Cagliostro's reputation came with the occult revival of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As interest in mysticism, esotericism, and alternative spirituality exploded, occultists looking for historical precedents discovered Cagliostro, and they embraced him. Helena Blavatsky, in her writings about the masters and ancient wisdom, claimed that Cagliostro had been one of the masters, or at least in contact with them. She argued that his persecution by the church proved he was teaching genuine truths that threatened orthodoxy, that his Egyptian rite contained fragments of authentic ancient wisdom. The Theosophical Society positioned Cagliostro as a spiritual ancestor, someone who'd attempted the same synthesis of Eastern and Western mysticism that they were now pursuing. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. This influential British occult order, founded in 1887, incorporated elements from Cagliostro's Egyptian rite into their own rituals. They saw him as a precursor who'd understood that Freemasonry contained deeper mysteries than most Masons realized, who'd attempted to restore the original mystical content. Golden Dawn members studied his techniques, his rituals, his teachings, not accepting them uncritically but treating them as serious contributions to Western occultism. The famous occultist Aleister Crowley, who himself deserves a Midnight Archives episode, claimed spiritual connection to Cagliostro. Crowley argued that Cagliostro had been a genuine adept, someone who'd achieved significant magical attainment, but whose teachings had been misunderstood by the unenlightened masses. Crowley even claimed, in some writings, to be Cagliostro reincarnated. Whether he actually believed this or was engaging in typical Crowley mythologizing is unclear. Various Rosicrucian organizations claimed Cagliostro as a member or even founder of their traditions. They argued that his Egyptian rite had been a Rosicrucian project disguised as Freemasonry. AMORC, Ancient and Mystical Order, Rosicrucis, one of the largest modern Rosicrucian groups, lists Cagliostro as one of their historical Grand Masters. This is almost certainly historically false, but it shows how his legacy was adopted by spiritual movements seeking prestigious pedigrees. As the 20th century progressed, historians began serious scholarly work on Cagliostro, attempting to separate fact from legend. Some conclusions: the fraud position. He was Giuseppe Balsamo, a talented conman who created an elaborate persona. His miracles were stage magic. His claims were deliberate lies. He fooled many people, but was eventually exposed. Case closed. The believer position. He was a genuine mystic who studied authentic traditions during his travels. His healings had real effects, even if the mechanisms aren't understood. His persecution by the church proved he threatened their power. He was martyred for teaching truth. The complex position. He was Giuseppe Balsamo, who genuinely transformed himself through study and practice. His phenomena were a mix of real and theatrical. He believed his own mythology while also consciously performing. He was neither simple fraud nor simple saint, but something more interesting, a religious innovator who used deception as a teaching tool. Most modern scholars accept some version of this third interpretation, because the evidence doesn't support the purely skeptical reading, but it also doesn't support the purely believing reading. Cagliostro was complicated, like most interesting historical figures. Regardless of whether he was charlatan or mystic, Cagliostro's cultural influence is undeniable. Opera and theatre. At least a dozen operas feature Cagliostro as a character, starting with works in the 1790s and continuing to the 20th century. Literature. Beyond Dumas, countless novels feature him, sometimes as villain, sometimes as hero, always as a figure of mystery and power. Film and television. He appears in period dramas about the French Revolution, in mystical thrillers, in historical documentaries. Occult practice. His Egyptian rite rituals are still performed by some groups. His techniques are studied by modern ceremonial magicians. Popular culture. The name Cagliostro has become shorthand for a mystical con man. When you want to describe someone as a charismatic fraud making impossible claims, you compare them to Cagliostro. He's entered the permanent cultural lexicon. But perhaps Cagliostro's most important legacy is philosophical. He represents a question that every society must answer. What do we do with people who claim to have transcended normal human limitations? Do we dismiss them automatically as frauds? But then we might miss genuine innovations, real breakthroughs in human potential. Do we believe them automatically? But then we're vulnerable to exploitation by charlatans. Cagliostro forces us to sit with uncertainty, to acknowledge that the line between deception and genuine mystical experience isn't always clear, that people can be both sincere and deceptive simultaneously, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but absence of evidence isn't quite evidence of absence. In an age of scientific materialism, Cagliostro reminds us that there might be more to reality than what's easily measurable, not because he proved his claims, but because he embodied a question that won't go away. What if? Let's summarize what we can state with reasonable certainty. A man calling himself Count Alessandro di Cagliostro appeared in European society around 1776. He was probably Giuseppe Balsamo from Palermo, Sicily, born around 1743. He demonstrated genuine knowledge of chemistry, medicine, languages, and occult traditions. He performed healing treatments that many credible witnesses reported as effective. He founded an Egyptian rite of Freemasonry that influenced later occult movements. He became involved in the diamond necklace affair, was tried and acquitted. He went to Rome, was arrested by the Inquisition, tried for heresy, and imprisoned. He died in San Leo Fortress in 1795. His legend has continued to grow for over 225 years. These are facts. Now come the mysteries. Was he really Giuseppe Balsamo, or did he assume that identity? The evidence strongly suggests yes, but there are gaps and inconsistencies that leave room for doubt. Where was he from 1768 to 1776, and what did he learn? The missing 8 years remain genuinely mysterious. His transformation from petty criminal to sophisticated mystic happened during this period, but we have no documentation of it. Were his healing abilities genuine, or all placebo and cold reading? Probably a mixture. He clearly had some genuine medical knowledge. The psychological components were likely significant. Whether there was anything beyond that, impossible to determine. Did he believe his own claims? This is perhaps the most interesting question. Did he know he was Giuseppe Balsamo from Sicily, consciously performing as Count Cagliostro? Or had he, through years of immersion in the role, actually become Cagliostro? Had the performed identity replaced the original? The evidence suggests he couldn't distinguish anymore, that the line between performance and reality had dissolved. Was there any truth to his claims about ancient Egyptian wisdom? No evidence he visited Egypt or studied in temples, but his rituals, while theatrical, did synthesize genuine elements from Hermetic traditions. He'd clearly studied these subjects extensively. Whether he genuinely understood them or just parroted them skillfully, unclear. At the end of all this research, I'm left with 3 equally plausible interpretations. Cagliostro the fraud, Giuseppe Balsamo, talented conman, created an elaborate persona to fleece European aristocrats. He learned stage magic, cold reading, basic medicine. He invented the Count Cagliostro character completely. Every miracle was a trick. Every prophecy was luck or vagueness. Every healing was placebo or coincidence. He almost succeeded in the greatest con of the century, but got caught up in the diamond necklace scandal. The Inquisition exposed him, imprisoned him, and he died knowing his entire life had been a lie. End of story. Cagliostro the mystic, Giuseppe Balsamo, or whoever he was, genuinely underwent mystical transformation during his travels. He studied with real masters, learned real techniques, achieved real spiritual attainment. His phenomena weren't all tricks. Some were genuine paranormal events. His healings worked through mechanisms science doesn't understand yet. The church persecuted him because he threatened their spiritual monopoly. He died in prison, martyred for teaching truth. His legacy continues in occult movements that preserve his authentic teachings. Cagliostro, the complex. Giuseppe Balsamo genuinely transformed himself through intense study and practice. He probably didn't travel as far or study as deeply as he claimed, but he did learn significant things. He combined genuine knowledge, medical, psychological, mystical, with theatrical presentation because that's how you communicate with people. He believed in the core of his teachings while also consciously performing. The fraud and the truth were so intertwined that even he couldn't separate them. He was neither hero nor villain, but a fascinating example of what happens when extraordinary charisma meets genuine intelligence, meets psychological complexity. He was creating a new reality through sheer force of will and belief. And in a sense, it worked, because here we are, 230 years later, still talking about him. I find the third interpretation most compelling because it's the most human. People aren't consistent. We believe our own lies. We perform authenticity. We construct identities and then forget they're constructed. Cagliostro might have started as Giuseppe Balsamo, consciously creating Count Cagliostro as a character. But after decades of performance, thousands of interactions, hundreds of rituals, the character became real. He was Cagliostro in the same way that an actor who's played a role for 20 years has merged with that role. Cagliostro claimed to be immortal. He sold an elixir of immortality. He promised his followers that through his Egyptian rite, they could transcend death. It was, by any rational measure, a false claim. He died, in a cell, alone, at 52, probably. His body rotted in an unmarked grave. But here we are, over 2 centuries later, discussing him. His name lives on. His story is retold. His rituals are still practiced. His legend continues to grow. He achieved a kind of immortality after all. Not the physical immortality he promised, but something stranger and perhaps more significant. Mythological immortality. He became a story that won't die, a question that won't be answered, an enigma that fascinates generation after generation. Giuseppe Balsamo is dead. Count Cagliostro is immortal. In our age of scientific materialism, it's tempting to dismiss figures like Cagliostro as mere historical curiosities. Con men who fooled gullible aristocrats before modern science taught us better. But that's too simple, because the questions Cagliostro embodies are still with us. Can human beings transcend their limitations? Can consciousness affect matter? Can belief create reality? Where's the line between performing transformation and achieving transformation? What do we do with people who claim impossible things? These aren't settled questions. Modern physics has made the relationship between observer and observed strange again. Neuroscience keeps finding that consciousness is weirder than we thought. The placebo effect is more powerful than we want to admit. Maybe, just maybe, Cagliostro's real legacy isn't his tricks or his teachings, but his willingness to live in the space of uncertainty, to claim more than he could prove, to insist that human potential extends beyond what's currently measurable. He was probably wrong about the specific claims, but he might have been right about the general principle, that reality is stranger and more malleable than orthodox materialism admits. Here's what haunts me about Cagliostro. If he was purely a fraud, why did he go to Rome? He knew it was dangerous. He knew the Inquisition wanted him. Any sensible con man would have stayed far away. But he went, walked directly into the trap. Why? Maybe he was desperate. Maybe he had nowhere else to go. Or maybe, just maybe, he actually believed he could convince the church, believed his powers were real, believed he was protected by higher forces. If he genuinely believed, if he walked into Rome thinking he was an enlightened adept who would triumph over ignorance, then his death in that cell wasn't the exposure of a fraud. It was a tragedy. A man who'd convinced himself of impossible things, dying alone in darkness, his delusions shattered. But if he knew he was a fraud, if he went to Rome as a form of surrender or suicide, then his death was something else. A final performance. The immortal Count choosing his own martyrdom, ensuring he'd be remembered forever. We'll never know which it was. And that's perfect, because Count Alessandro di Cagliostro, the immortal charlatan, the mystical con man, the man who claimed to have lived 1,000 lives, his greatest trick was becoming a mystery that can't be solved, a question that can't be answered, a legend that refuses to die. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most enduring enigmas. If you found value in this exploration of truth, deception, and the strange space between them, please like this video and subscribe to the Midnight Archives. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Do you think Cagliostro was the greatest con man in history, a genuine mystic, or something far more complicated? This has been the story of Count Alessandro di Cagliostro, the mortal who sold immortality, the fraud who might have been telling the truth, the man who disappeared into his own legend and has lived there ever since. Whether he was Giuseppe Balsamo or someone else, whether he possessed genuine powers or just brilliant showmanship, his story reminds us that the line between reality and performance is always thinner than we think, and that sometimes the most interesting question isn't what's the truth, but why do we want so badly to believe? Till next time, this has been the Midnight Archives.